It's also the case that our speech is multimodal. So in other words, we end up combining information not just from what we're hearing, so not just the pure auditory input that comes in, but we also end up using visual cues, so visual information, particularly of lip movements, to guide and interpret what it is we're actually perceiving. So one nice demonstration of this was done by McGurk and MacDonald back in the 1970s with something that is known as the McGurk effect. So in this study, they prepared a videotape of someone who would say bar repeatedly, and at the same time they changed the sound channel so that the voice said gar instead of bar. And in this original study, the authors were interested in understanding which of these inputs were going to dominate. So would it be the case that people would interpret based purely on the auditory information and they would say, yeah, I'm perceiving bar, or would it be dominated by the visual input of gar? And unexpectedly, they found that actually people were taking a combination or a blend of these two inputs, and they would actually report perceiving hearing the sound dar, because that's a combination between the two of these. So we're combining both this visual and auditory input when we're making any judgments of speech perception. And in everyday life, it makes a lot of sense that we would combine this auditory and visual information to kind of boost our perceptual ability. So if you're at a party and there's really loud music going on in the background and someone says to you, do you want to dance? It makes a lot of sense that you want to rely heavily on these visual cues and the lip reading just to kind of remove any uncertainty or ambiguity that is there with what you're actually hearing through auditory channels. Let's take a moment to have a look at the McGurk effect in a little bit more detail.
At any one moment, we are being bombarded by sensory information. Our brains do a remarkable job of making sense of it all. It seems easy enough to separate the sounds we hear from the sights we see. But there is one illusion that reveals this isn't always the case.
Ba, ba, ba.
Have a look at this. What do you hear?
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
But look what happens when we change the picture.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba.
And yet, the sound hasn't changed. In every clip, you are only ever hearing bar with a B.
Ba, ba, ba.
It's an illusion known as the McGurk effect.
Ba,
Take another look.
ba.
Concentrate first on the right of the screen.
Ba,
Now to the left of the screen.
ba.
The illusion occurs because what you are seeing clashes with what you are hearing.
In the illusion, what we see overrides what we hear. So the mouth movements we see as we look at a face can actually influence what we believe we're hearing. If we close our eyes, we actually hear the sound as it is. If we open our eyes, we actually see how the mouth movements can influence what we're hearing. Ba, ba, ba.
It's a bizarre effect. Remember, the only sound you're hearing is bar with a B.
Ba, 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 ba.
What's remarkable about this illusion is even knowing how it's done doesn't seem to make a difference.
Ba. The effect works no matter how much you know about the effect. I've been studying the McGurk effect for 25 years now, and I've been the face in the stimuli. I've seen stimuli thousands and thousands of times, but the effect still works on me. I can't help it. The speech brain just takes in that information and doesn't care about what outside knowledge you bring to bear. Ba, 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 ba.
The McGurk effect shows us that what we hear may not always be the truth.
Ba,
But it also helps us to understand what happens when our senses conflict.
Ba, ba, ba. When the brain has the conflicting information, it tries to make sense of that conflict. And depending on what type of modality is providing more, salient information, that information might override or at least combine with the other information.
Okay, let's turn our attention now to our ability to understand entire sentences. So when we read or listen to a sentence, our central goal is typically to understand it. And being able to understand sentences involves a number of different processes and kinds of information. And in the following slides, we're going to consider some of these different processes. So at the very top level, first of all, we need to be able to identify the language's syntactical or grammatical structure. So basically trying to work out how are these words being put together. And technically this is known as parsing. And most of the time, assigning grammatical structure to a sentence appears to be fairly easy. However, there are numerous sentences where the grammatical structure is ambiguous and not easily defined. So for example, in the two sentences here, the girl looked at the boy with the telescope. That is an ambiguous sentence, and the fact that you could interpret this in two different ways. It could be that you have the girl is looking at the boy who is holding a telescope, or she could be using the telescope herself to look at the boy. So the question is, how do we go about making sense of these kind of ambiguities? So how do we go and resolve this ambiguity? So when we're trying to resolve this ambiguity, we can use multiple different sources of information to try and come to an appropriate interpretation of how that sentence is structured. So we can use syntactic information, semantic information, and kind of general world knowledge to decide on what is the most appropriate interpretation of the sentence. Competing analyses of the current sentence are then activated and are ranked according to activation strength. So based on the combined information of all of these cues, certain representations are just going to be more probable or more likely. So those are going to be more strongly activated. And one factor that seems to be particularly important in influencing how we assign syntactic structure to a sentence is through something known as verb bias. And verb bias is simply the fact that some verbs occur more often within a particular syntactic or grammatical structure than others. So many verbs can occur within a variety of different syntactic structures, but are found more often in some than others. So readers will tend to assume initially that the more common syntactic structure is correct. So an example of this is we find that sentences are processed much faster when the verb read is followed by an expected syntax, something as a direct object, rather than when used within unexpected syntax, such as a sentence complement. So if you look at the two sentences at the bottom of the slide here, the child read the book on the plane journey, is processed much faster than if you read the child read the book had been lost. So it would take a lot longer for people to understand or comprehend the second one, because it's followed by expected syntax that has low probability. It's unexpected, it's hard to interpret. So it is the case that we seem to be capable of parsing sentences and working out their syntactic structure. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that after doing this we actually come up with accurate representations of the content of the sentences. So some research that demonstrated some difficulties that we have in understanding sentences was work by Ferreira. And this considered the impact of top-down expectations and heuristics on the way that we process sentences. So for example, in these studies, participants would be presented with a couple of sentences that they listened to, such as the mouse was eaten by the cheese and the man was visited by the woman. If you then ask them to explain what occurred in the sentences that they just listened to, people would often make mistakes. So not 100% of the time, but often they would use their own expectations and biases to interpret the meaning of these sentences. So let's look at the first sentence. If you listen to "the mouse was eaten by the cheese," this doesn't really make too much sense. Unless you see this visually, the idea of a piece of cheese eating a mouse, it goes against all of our prior expectations of how that is likely to happen. So instead, people assume that they've heard "the mouse ate the cheese." So we're using heuristics and shortcuts here to assume that the subject is the agent of the action, because this is what usually happens in most of English sentences. So in general, we're motivated to process sentences until we can come up with a representation that makes sense and it's kind of good enough for the current purpose. So as a result, a lot of the time our interpretation or understanding of sentences that we hear can be incorrect.
Wow, quite a drink order.
Oh, well, when in Rome.
Yes. Please go on.
So another issue in understanding speech is the fact that the content of sentences is often insufficient to understand an individual's meaning. So for example, the idiom "when in Rome" is something that you say which means when you're visiting another country or in a specific environment, you should behave like the people in that country or the people in that culture and environment. So in the clip before, we see a misinterpretation of the sentence in its literal form. There are also many more ways in which we can confuse the literal and intended meaning that result as a consequence of irony or sarcasm and understatement. And pragmatics is concerned with practical language and comprehension, and especially about how we can go beyond taking the literal meaning and account for the social context. So an example of this might be if someone walks in from outside and it's the rainy season and they're soaking wet and they're with an umbrella and they say, "The weather's great." We can assume that they mean that the weather is actually terrible. Let's pay attention to, this is an example of sarcasm taken from the series Friends.
I got her machine. I got her machine.
Her answering machine?
No, interestingly enough, her leaf blower picked up.
So this is one of Chandler's many sarcastic responses. So when mentioning he got a machine, most people would assume that he's referring to the answering machine. So we're already here using some top-down semantic knowledge. However, Joey clearly isn't and wants clarification that it's the answering machine. And when we hear Chandler's response that the leaf blower picked up, we know he's being sarcastic due to the unplausibility of this being true. Okay, we must also try to work out people's intentions from what they say. So if you consider the following example where someone asks their friend, "Did she agree to go out with you?" and they respond by saying, "She's not my type," this is an indirect reply that you can tell it has the motivation of saving face. Interestingly, if we suppose that Bob gave a response that didn't save face, so when we're listening to other people say something, we're also actively trying to work out the speaker's intentions from what they've just said. So if you consider the following example that comes from research by Holgraves in 1998, it's an interaction between Ken and Bob, where Ken asks, "Did she agree to go out with you?" Participants were then presented with one response where Bob says, "She's not my type." In this case, most people would interpret Bob's reply as meaning that she hadn't agreed to go out with him, but he wanted to save face. So there was a kind of clear motivation of saving face that underlies this. In contrast, participants took 50% longer to comprehend or understand the second type of response. So if Bob said, "She's my type," it's really hard to understand the speaker's motivation with this indirect reply. So again, with this, a lot of the time we're using people's underlying motivations to help us interpret and understand what it is they're saying. So much of our conversations has a difficulty in the fact that there's a kind of conflict or difference between the literal content of what we're saying and the intended meaning of what we're saying. So we're often trying to use language to both convey a sort of proposition or a command, whilst at the same time wanting to maintain social relationships. So express these commands in a way that isn't insulting or rude or kind of dominant. So this problem with language is that the very act of making a request in words can clash with the ongoing relationship type. So if you use an imperative like give me the salt, this assumes a dominance relationship. If you're bossing someone around or commanding them, that might clash with a friendship. So instead of this, we ask in the polite form, if you could pass the salt, that would be great, or that would be awesome. I mean, it's not going to be awesome. It's just somebody passing you the salt. But we phrase it like this to avoid appearing dominant or kind of bossy. Similarly, if you get pulled over by the police for some sort of driving offence and you say to them like, gee officer, is there some way we could take care of the ticket right here without going to court or doing a lot of paperwork? There's a kind of implicit intended meaning here that you're willing to offer a bribe without actually saying that in a literal sense. So that gives you some kind of plausible deniability here in this conversation. Similarly, if you've been out on a romantic date with somebody and at the end of the date they say, would you like to come up for some coffee? This generally doesn't mean, would you like to come up for a literal cup of coffee? It's an invite for some kind of romantic sexual advance. But it also has the benefit of allowing for a rebuttal without either party feeling embarrassed. So if you ask, would you like to come up for some coffee? And the other person says, no, I'm a little bit tired right now. I think I'm going to go back to my place and go to sleep. That's very different rather than if you asked in the literal sense, do you want to come up and have romantic relationships with me? So it allows for that acceptable rebuttal. Likewise, there can be indirect threats that are delivered. So, for example, in the bottom right-hand side, I hear you're the jury foreman in the Soprano trial. It's an important civic responsibility. We know you'll do the right thing. Doing the right thing, you understand what they mean by this without them conveying the actual literal sense here. Another factor that's relevant in understanding others is common ground. So common ground refers to the shared knowledge and beliefs possessed by both a speaker and a listener. And it's something we typically use to try and assist communication. So you can think of examples where you use common ground, such as if I'm talking to an elderly relative about my life in Thailand, I might try and keep the conversation limited to discussion of the food that there is, the beaches. If I know they hadn't been to Asia, I wouldn't bother drawing comparisons with Thailand and other Asian countries because I know this isn't shared common ground. This isn't something that they're likely to have much insight into. And if I start doing this, they're going to probably struggle to follow this conversation too well. Similarly, if I started to talk to you right now about the sports that I'm into, I might try and keep the topics in my speech quite general, or I might focus on sports that I would expect you to have an understanding of, so maybe tennis, football, whereas I wouldn't start talking to you about the intricacies of cricket and whether you saw some kind of controversial cricket event over the last couple of weeks, because I know that that is not likely to be shared common ground. Now, unfortunately, we often use our own knowledge and biases to interpret what we hear, rather than actually bothering to make the effort to understand speech based on common ground. So this is known as a egocentric heuristic. So for example, if I'm chatting to my elderly relative and I'm talking to her about things that are going on in Thailand, she might easily interpret my speech based on whatever misconceptions she already possesses about Thailand. So if she thinks it's unsafe and I'm telling her about my neighborhood, she might already have a mental framework where she's interpreting the story that I'm telling in order to fit with this current knowledge and current expectations or biases that she has. So when we're speaking to other people, our fundamental goal is in order to be able to communicate with them. And in this regard, for the most part, our efforts at speaking seem relatively effortless. So our normal speaking rate is 2 to 3 words, which equates to 120, 180 or 200 words per minute. Despite the fact that this seems effortless to us, the reason that we're able to achieve this is because we use a number of shortcuts or simplifications in the way that we communicate. One of the ways that we can do this is through pre-formulation. So this involves reducing the processing costs by producing phrases that we've heard before and previously used. So about 70% of our speech consists of word combinations that are used frequently. Pre-formulation is especially common among groups of people who need to speak very rapidly. So if you listen to horse racing commentary, or for example at an auction, where somebody needs to increase like above 200 words per second, you would find the same phrases keep getting used over and over again. Another strategy that we can use is underspecification. So this is the use of simplified expressions in which we don't necessarily use the full meaning. So anytime that you use phrases such as and things like that, something, we're using this in place of spelling out the full articulated meaning. So if you look at, for example, recipe instructions, when it tells you to wash and core 6 cooking apples and then put them in the oven, under specification here is like the putting them in the oven. Alternatively, you should, if you wanted to say this fully, is to put the 6 cooking apples into the oven. But we underspecify and simplify the whole time. Okay, another way in which speakers can make use of what they've just heard, the other person saying, is through syntactic priming. So this occurs when previously experienced syntactic structures influence our current processing. So if you want a concrete example of this, if you've just heard somebody else use the passive sentence, the man was bitten by the dog, this is going to increase the chance that you will then produce a passive sentence yourself. So when you're talking about a different topic, you would then be more likely to adopt this use of the passive voice. And again, this isn't something that we're consciously doing, it's just something that we implicitly pick up and automatically do. Now generally our speech is typically occurring in a social context, so we're communicating with other people, and Grice proposed that there are 4 maxims that should be adhered to in order to facilitate or maximize the communication that occurs. This should typically involve a degree of cooperation between the speaker and the listener. So more specifically, he proposed these 4 what are known as Gricean maxims that people should adhere to throughout their conversation. So the postulate of quantity is that the speaker should be as informative as necessary, but not more so. An example of this might be if someone asks you, what is the temperature outside? And you responded, it's 31.297868, etc. degrees out there, you are violating this maxim of quantity because you're giving more information than was probably wanted by somebody. So within the context of a friend asking you, what is the temperature outside? You kind of want to know the temperature to the nearest sort of 1 or 2 degrees, or even 5 degrees maybe. You want to know if it's hot or really hot. The question is different if the context is you're in a laboratory and you're recording the temperature of things and it really matters. In that case, if you gave a very precise response, you wouldn't be violating the maximum quantity. But based on the context, we want to be as informative as necessary, but no more so. The maximum of quality is the speaker should be truthful. So you're expected to say what you believe to be the case. Irony, sarcasm, and jokes might seem to be exceptions to the maximum quality, but they're not. And they're not if we know that the listener is expected to reliably identify or recognize that we're using irony or sarcasm. So if the listener is able to do this, then they're going to infer the speaker's true state of mind from what is said. The maximum of relation refers to the fact you should make your contributions to the conversation relevant to the aims of the conversation. So you can probably know somebody within your social group where you might, if there's 4 or 5 of you talking about one thing, and a friend suddenly kind of chips in and they talk about something that is totally unrelated to the conversation. Unless that conversation had died down and it was an appropriate time to change the conversational topic, then most of the time we should be keeping our input relevant to the current context and the story. Again, in a business context, you might find large meetings where there's always someone that kind of chips into something that isn't really relevant to the current meeting that you're having. And finally, we have the maximum of manner. And you can think of this as just keeping your conversational input as straightforward so that it makes sense to other people. So one of the examples here, Richard Feynman described how he once read a paper by a well-known scholar. One sentence went something like this: the individual member of the social community often receive information via visual, symbolic channels. Now, Feynman concluded in essence that the scholar was violating the maximum manner when he realized that the sentence simply meant people read. So yes, there's times when you need to say things in a elaborate sense, but we should try to keep things so that they avoid as much complexity or obscurity as possible. We want to do other people a favor and make it easy for them to understand what you're communicating. Okay, there are also a number of other ways in which speakers can make it easier for listeners to understand what they're trying to convey. And one of these is through the use of various gestures. So we often coordinate in timing and meaning with the words that we're speaking. We move our hands around. And these gestures serve a communicative function by increasing the listener's ability to make sense of the speaker's message. So some of the evidence that the gestures produced by speakers actually do assist in communication was reported by Moll et al. So in these studies they asked speakers to describe an animated cartoon to a video camera. Now, in one condition, the speakers were told that the camera was being used as a web camera, and then another participant would be watching and listening to them. So in other words, their gestures are going to be useful and informative. In another condition, they were told that the information would be sent to an artificial audio-visual summarizer, but not to another person. And what they found in this, that people tended to use 6 times as many gestures when the speakers thought that they were communicating to another person. So if we think it's going to actively help the listener, we're much more likely to engage in and use these gestures. Similarly, Jacobs and Garnham showed that speakers can be very responsive to the listener's needs. So in their study, speakers described comic strips to listeners. When the listener was attentive and they couldn't see the comic strips, the speakers made lots of elaborate gestures to try and help them out. Whereas in contrast, if they picked up that the listener wasn't really attentive, so they weren't paying too much attention to them, and they knew that the speaker could see the comic strips, then they didn't really bother engaging in the use of too many gestures. So again, we're using this if we're interpreting that within this situation, within this context, these gestures are going to help the other person, then let's use them. So one music example that I watched recently where you can see that the use of gestures can clearly convey some sort of meaning and sometimes can distract you from the true or obvious meaning is this woman who's telling a joke in Spanish on the Graham Norton show. So just watch this and look at the use of gestures from her.
A lady from Colombia. Where's the lady from Colombia? Oh, there you are. Hello, stand up too. Hi. What's your name?
Patricia. Or Patricia.
Oh, Patricia. Patricia. Okay. So, do you want to... What, should we hear it? What language is this going to be?
Spanish, yes.
Well, who can translate that?
What language?
Is it quick? Is it quick?
I could make it quick.
Well, tell it quickly in Spanish, and then we'll then tell it again in English.
He speaks English.
What? All right, just tell it in English. Then. Just tell it.
Oh, you ruined it. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Tell it in Spanish. Yeah, Ricky, you ruined it. Tell it in Spanish quickly.
Right. Dos amigos se encuentran después de mucho tiempo de no verse y empiezan a hablar del pasado y de los amigos y etcétera. Y uno le dice al otro, ¿has visto a alguien del pasado? Y dice, no, vi a María. Ah, María. ¿Quién es María? No, María... ¿Te acuerdas de María? ¿Te acuerdas de María? Una chica muy delgada, plana, no tenía tetas. Sí, me acuerdo. Pues la vi la semana pasada. ¿Y qué? ¿Está así? No. ¿Se hizo cirugía cosmética en las tetas? No, artritis, una artritis horrible.
All right. You're in English. Do you...
I got the gist of it, but I don't know if I'm going to do it justice. A monkey with huge boobs going...
Okay, well, tell us in English.
Okay, two friends meet after a long time. They're old school friends, and they talk about the past. And have you seen this? Have you seen someone? He said, oh, yes, I saw Maria. Funnily enough, I saw Maria last week. Who is Maria? You remember Maria? She was very slim, very flat-chested. You remember? Not very pretty. Oh, yes, I remember her, yes. Well, I saw her, and she's looking like this. Wow, she had, breast enlargement. No, she's got terrible arthritis.
Very good. Okay.
Because they thought she was saying she's like this, i.e. she's got huge breasts. But they go, no, she's got terrible arthritis.
I'll translate the English.
Okay, we've seen that speakers adjust their gestures to take account of the listener's needs. However, speakers can also underestimate the value of gestures as a means for communication. So in one study by Gerwing and Allison, they asked pairs of participants to use words and gestures to describe the layout of an apartment. Speakers thought that only 25% of their gestures provided essential information that was missing from their speech. However, 97% of their gestures contributed some form of additional information. So they found that the gestures were far more effective than words, particularly for communicating information about the features of the apartment, such as the size, the shape, and the location of various rooms. And you can try this if you do this by explaining to one of your family members or someone that's at home at the moment. If you describe the layout of a room that they've never been to, if you're standing face to face opposite them, you would typically find yourself using a lot of gestures in order to indicate where one thing is positioned relative to another thing. So we also know that gestures are not only useful for providing additional information to the listener, they can also be useful for aiding our own semantic retrieval. So some research by Frick Horbury and Gutenberg presented the definitions of 50 relatively uncommon words and asked participants to try and think of which words were being defined here. So if I give you the example of this description of a one-sided drum with loose metallic discs in the side that is played by shaking. Now typically most people might find it difficult to identify what is the target object here. And when you're doing this, people often then engage in physical actions and gestures that resemble this. So you might take one of your hands and imagine that you're actually shaking this implement right now. And if you're doing this and it suddenly comes to your mind, then you might realize that the answer to this was a tambourine. So typically they find a positive benefit on this. So in their study, they would have some participants that were allowed to make these gestures, and other participants who had to hold a rod with both hands, which is going to limit their ability to make gestures. So those ones that couldn't make gestures produced an average of only 19 words out of the 50, whereas those who had their hands free to make as many gestures as possible produced an average of 24 words out of the 50 definitions that they were presented. So you've got some, it's not a huge benefit, but there's a small benefit of being able to make these gestures increases our ability to retrieve semantic information about these objects. We can also use prosodic cues to help make it easier for the listener to understand what speakers are trying to say. So prosodic cues include the way that we change the stress, the tone, or the rhythm of our speech. It turns out that a lot of the time we're not necessarily that effective at actually using prosodic cues. And we particularly use these prosodic cues most often when there's some degree of ambiguity in the context of the speech. So we know that unless we're using changes in the stress, the tone, and the rhythm, that the listener might struggle to understand the intended meaning of what we're saying. And that's not to say we're always particularly effective at doing this. So some of the research that has investigated this was by Snedeker and Truswell. So they argued that we're going to use these prosodic cues when the context fails to clarify the meaning of an ambiguous sentence. So in this experiment, participants were in pairs, and one person was asked to perform an action, and the second person was asked to read out a scripted sentence that would then explain that action. So in one example here, we can think about an ambiguous sentence was tap the frog with the flower. Now on the visual display that was presented to them, they had a frog, there's a flower, there's a frog with a flower, there's a brick. So there's a kind of ambiguity in what this is meaning. It could mean either picking up the flower and using it to tap the frog, or tapping the frog who has the flower. Now, depending on what was shown, this influenced the use of prosodic cues. So in contrast, when the phrase they were given wasn't ambiguous, prosody was not used. So this is an illustration of how the objects would be positioned and what we have. So we've got a frog at the top left-hand side, we've got a brick at the bottom left, there's a flower, it's kind of like a leopard or something. And at the bottom right, there is a frog holding a flower. And you could explain that I want you to tap the frog with the flower. That would convey pretty clearly that you're wanting to pick up the flower and tap one of the frogs with it. Whereas if I want you to understand that you need to tap the frog with the flower, that's more likely to convey that I want you to tap that frog that's at the bottom right hand side with the small flower there. Again, I'll be honest, it is difficult for participants to accurately and effectively use prosodic cues the whole time. So in some of the other research, we find that listeners only really understand or are able to interpret other people's prosodic cues about 2/3 of the time. So our prosodic cues are not always actually that effective for listeners. Okay, let's think about some of the stages that are involved in speech production. And there's several levels or stages of processing that are involved here. So at the very top level, we initially decide in a very kind of abstract process what it is we want to say, and finish up by producing a sentence. So Gary Dell in 1986 argued that we have 4 levels involved here. So if you look at the figure, at the very initial level, we're engaging in some kind of planning of the message to be communicated, and this is done at the semantic level. So we have start off with an abstract representation of the idea that we want to convey. So right now, you want a biscuit. We then think about the grammatical structure of the words, then the morphological level, so the basic units of meaning are worked out, and at the phonological level, the phonemes or basic units of sound that need to go within that sentence. And you might think, looking at this figure, that this occurs in a purely hierarchical sense, going from semantic, syntactic, morphological, phonological. And generally, this is the case, but as we'll see, there's different levels of this process that seem to interact with each other. Now, one of the nice ways that we can demonstrate these processes or stages of speech is through looking at particular errors, so speech errors that occur to us. So one of these speech errors is the tip of the tongue state. So that feeling that accompanies temporary inaccessibility of an item that a person is trying to retrieve. So this suggests that our semantic processing is successful. So we accurately possess the correct concept in the mind, but we're not able to access or identify the phonological processing. So we can't produce the actual sound of the word. And this tip of the tongue seems to occur due to weak activation of the target word. So one example, just before putting this lecture together, I was listening to somebody else talk about an issue they had doing a video lecture, and they were searching for the word seagull, and it wouldn't come to their mind. So clearly they've got this concept of what it is they're trying to refer to, and they end up describing it as a beach pigeon instead, which is kind of a much cooler name for a seagull anyway. So to understand why we actually go about making speech errors, one of the most important concepts is the idea that there is spreading activation that occurs when we're activating different nodes during the speech production phase. So the basic premise is that we have these nodes within a network that vary in their level of activation, and when a node is activated, this activation spreads from it to other related nodes. So this is the associative networks that we've already talked about in previous lectures. So when you're activating a node that corresponds, say, to the concept of tree, this is going to cause some activation of nodes that are corresponding to related, so semantically related concepts such as plant. Now, during speech production, the processes that are involved are all occurring in parallel at the same time. So when we're planning an utterance, this is leading to activation of several of the sounds and the words in the intended sentence before we speak. So the assumption here is that the speech errors occur when an incorrect item is more activated than the correct one. So if you suppose that you wanted to say you've wasted the whole term, this might lead to activation of all of the words in the sentence during that initial planning phase, and as a result you might make an error where you say, like, you've tasted the whole worm, and we'll come on to what that particular error is in a minute. Activation typically extends to words that are related in meaning to those in the intended sentence. So for example, you might intend to say, give me a spoon. However, activation of the word spoon is going to lead to activation of those semantically related concepts such as fork. So you might make a mistake of saying, give me a fork. Whereas you're unlikely to make a mistake of give me a television, given that there isn't any semantic associational relationship between spoon and television. Given that we don't make speech errors all the time, how can this kind of chaos or frequent speech errors be avoided? And Dell argued that through learning, we develop and possess a kind of effectively a syntactic traffic cop that monitors what we intend to say and inhibits any words that don't belong to the appropriate syntactical or grammatical category. So this traffic cop basically explains why we nearly always replace a noun with another noun and a verb with a verb when we do make mistakes when speaking. So it's very rare that you would swap a noun for a verb or vice versa. So according to spreading the activation theory, speech errors occur because an incorrect item is sometimes more activated than the correct item. We can use these speech errors to understand the processes underlying speech production, and particularly distinguishing between these different processes or phases of speech production. And generally they provide evidence that we don't plan just one word at a time. Rather, speech planning is done at several different levels of analysis in parallel consecutively. Okay, one important insight with regard to our speech errors is the fact that they are typically not random in nature. For example, most of our phonological speech errors that we make generally form words rather than non-words. And this is referred to as a lexical bias effect, and we'll come on to this again in a minute. We also find that our speech errors occur among several different sized units. So at the phrase level, they can occur, I wouldn't buy kids for the macadamia nuts. They can occur at the word level, I have to fill up the gas with the car. At the morpheme level, oh, that's just a back trucking out. In that case, we've mixed up or switched the truck backing out. They can occur at the syllable level. So it might be the case that you mistakenly say canpakes instead of pancakes, or butterpillar and caterfly. And it can occur at the phoneme level, so saying fost and lound instead of lost and found. If we look at some of these specific types of errors and what they can teach us, we can start off with anticipatory errors. So the speaker might use a language element before it's appropriate in the sentence because it corresponds to an element that will be needed later in the utterance. So for example, instead of saying an inspiring expression, a speaker might say an expiring expression. Similarly, we can use perseveration. So the speaker uses a language element that was appropriate earlier in the sentence but is not appropriate later on. So for example, a speaker might say, we sat down to a bounteous beast, instead of what they want to say is a bounteous feast. We can use substitution. So the speaker substitutes one language element for another. For example, you may have warned someone to do something after it is too late, when you meant before it is too late. We can use reversals, so also called transposition. The speaker switches the positions of two language elements. We can use spoonerisms, so the initial sounds of two words are reversed, making two entirely different words. So this term is named after Reverend Spooner, who was famous for identifying them. Some of his choicest slips include, you have hissed all my mystery lectures, instead of missed all my history lectures. And malapropisms, where one word is replaced by another that is similar in sound but different in meaning. So furniture dealers who are selling naughty pine instead of knotty pine. And most speech errors can be classed as falling into anticipatory, so where we're speaking sounds ahead of time and are reflecting poor planning, or perseveratory, so sounds spoken later than they should have been, that are reflecting poor monitoring. Now, according to Dell, expert speakers plan ahead more than non-expert ones, and this leads them to have increased activation of future sounds and words. As a result of this, a high proportion of the speech errors that expert speakers make are anticipatory, whereas in contrast, non-expert speakers, because they're not planning the words in advance so much, they tend to have relatively fewer anticipatory errors. So one example of a study to demonstrate this would Delatel trained participants to say a difficult tongue twister. So this was 5 frantic fat frogs. You can keep trying to say that one as quickly as you can. 5 frantic fat frogs. As training progressed, they got better. So their overall number of errors decreased. But they made proportionately more anticipatory errors. So you're more likely to make an error where you replace one of the words coming up. You replace the current word with one of the words that is coming up next. So again, practice enhance the activation of the present and particularly the future words at the expense of past sounds and words. So you're much more likely when you practice on something to make these anticipatory errors because these future sounds are becoming more strongly activated. Okay, let's change topic a little bit. So we know that our language is primarily a tool that we use to communicate to other people, but it's also something that allows us to think, and it allows us to be creative and express novel thoughts. So we can use our language to write down ideas and connect concepts, and think of things that are novel to us, and we're coming up with inventions and kind of mental wordplay. But we find that some theorists have gone beyond this idea to argue that the language that we use really constrains the thoughts that we can have and the thoughts that we can think about objects and events. So this is ideas that come from or originate with Edward Sapir and Benjamin Whorf, who lent on work that was originally done by Franz Boas, actually on the ideas that Eskimos have this really kind of varied language and different concepts for different types of snow. And they use this to come up with a proposal that became known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that in the absence of having a concept, we're unable to think of or unable to express particular thoughts. And they presented this in 2 different forms. So there was a strong form which is referred to as linguistic determinism, whereby language determines the way that we think, and basic cognitive processes differ depending on the language that we use. So our thoughts that we have are determined by the categories that are made available by the language. So in other words, if we don't have 2 words in our language to distinguish between some concept, so if we didn't have a word that distinguished between red and yellow, we would be unable to think and to process these 2 concepts in a different way, would be unable to distinguish them apart from each other. So that's in the kind of strong form, and I don't think many people would go along with this. In a weaker form, it's the idea that there are parallels between the structure of the language and the way that speakers of that language think. So in other words, the way that our language is structured has some influence or bearing on the way that we think about things, the way that we're able to communicate with others. And we'll see some examples of this later. So here's one famous example of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that's studied by Lira Borodetsky and Alice Gaby. So we have this Aboriginal group called the Pormpuraaw tribe. So this is a Aboriginal group in northern Australia that speak this language, Cook Thiorai. And these members of the tribe have a very unusual way of referring to direction. So in English, we would typically use terms such as left and right, front and back. But in Cook Thiorai, the tribe here refer to the cardinal directions of north, south, east and west. So if you're sitting around the dinner table with members of the Pormpuraaw tribe who speak Cook Thiorai, an English speaker might say, I'm going to put the fork to the left of the plate. Whereas the members of these tribe would say, put the fork to the west of the plate. But obviously only if they were actually facing towards the north. So this feature of language obviously affects how the individuals of the tribe locate themselves and locate other people in space. But it also affects their conception of time. So if English speakers are given a series of cartoon panels that depict a story, so something that clearly progresses from a beginning to an end, they will put this in a temporal sequence that goes from left to right, which is how we write things. But you'll find that, for example, Hebrew is written from right to left, and Hebrew speakers will arrange the panels from the right to the left as well. But the Pomperaur tribe will arrange the panels from east to west. So depending on how they're oriented, they're going to place the things that occurred earliest on the east direction and the things that occur last in the story on the west side. So to illustrate this, if you gave them a sequence of 4 pictures here and you asked them to arrange these pictures, which we've got an individual who's differing in age from being a boy up to kind of adolescent, middle-aged man, and then still kind of middle or elderly aged man. English people would place that from a left to right orientation. Members from Israel, the Hebrew language, would place this from a right to left orientation. Whereas the Kukthayore tribe, depending on how they are currently oriented, so if they're facing towards the north, they would place it going from east to west. But if you turn them around and then have them facing currently now south and ask them to place these down in order, they would continue to place them east to west. So they would now put them left to right hand side. However, we find several pieces of evidence that are kind of counterexamples or contradict the idea of the sort of strong form of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So some work that was done by Hyder and Oliver. They tested members of the Dani tribe, so this is a group in New Guinea, on their colour perception and colour memory ability. And they chose this because their language has only concepts of dark and light. So dark, which they refer to as milli, and light, also corresponding to concepts of warm, that they refer to as molar. Now, in these kinds of experiments, where they ask participants to name different colour patches, then the Dani tribe perform significantly worse than English-speaking college students. And you'll kind of expect this. So if you give them a rich palette of different colours and you ask them to describe what is this colour type, what is this one, they don't linguistically distinguish between them very well. However, if you give them a memory task where you then present matching colour patches from memory, the Dani tribe do perform about as good as the English speakers did. So if you present them a colour, and then after a delay you present them a colour patch, and you say, does this match the colour that you saw previously, their accuracy is almost as good as American subjects, suggesting that they still have this relatively rich, at least perceptual ability. So their colour perception ability is not impaired by the fact that they have this limited linguistic description of the different types of colours.